Hi, folks. We're Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the really never-ending and ongoing and changing controversy around the role of British Prime Minister and statesman Winston Churchill in not only world affairs during his time as say, a senior government official or even prime minister during World War II, and what were the effects of the world that he put in place. His so-called, very courageous standing up to tyranny and all this sort of stuff. Now, commentators such as Tucker Carlson have quite reasonably said, well, okay, Churchill fought this great war for supposed freedom. Where are these freedoms today? English people are being locked up for thrown in prison for just disagreeing with mass migration or something, making an edgy social media post about transgenders, and that's enough to get you dragged into court and thrown in prison. So what freedoms did Churchill fight for? And if those freedoms were so easily taken away as they have been by the globalists, then what was the point of what Churchill did? And if what he left behind was so fragile and so easily taken away, then in a supposed democratic system, what was the point? What was Churchill fighting for? And if he left behind something that was so easily could not be defended or so easily taken away, what did Churchill achieve? What was all the blood and toil and money for, and so on? So these are the type of arguments that are raging back and forth. I think all of them miss the point. Now, there are various other factors crowding, and Churchill is considered by many as a great British statesman. I think in a number of votes, who is the greatest Briton, that Churchill's name comes up as number one or number two, and has done for 50, 70 years or so. Now, for that reason, the globalists and the leftists want to tear Churchill down. He's he was a bad guy and a tyrant. He was a fascist and so on, a racist and so on and so forth. So that's hardly something that flies, but he's been denigrated left, right, and centre by those that see him as a rallying point of pride in historical terms, a rallying point of pride for white British people, and to globalists that just cannot be allowed. So Churchill has to be torn down. Leftists want to have a good old kicking at Churchill because he was implacably opposed to communism in Eastern Europe, and believed that the gay lesbian stuff and union activism was all part of the wider, which it was, by the way, all part of the wider communist Soviet effort to destabilize the West. So he's hated for those reasons. The ones that defend Churchill as a great British statesman, and he clearly was that. I think, get a little bit starry-eyed and misty-eyed about days gone by and the greatness of the British Empire and so on. So what I'd like to do in this essay is try and set a few things straight, and because I think they're all missing the point. I saw another essay by Konstantin Kisin, and I think he's missing the point as well. And so anyway, what does a dumbass like me know? What do I know? I don't know anything, but let me at least give some perspective here. Now, Churchill, remember, Britain went from being the world's greatest superpower into being a second-rate, in fact, desperately clinging on to not even be a third-rate power during Churchill's lifetime. So that was the great, Britain, the great empire went from being supreme top dog to being a third-rate flunky, all within Churchill's lifetime. So the decline was swift and astonishing. And now Britain, when Churchill was born, he was born into the era of empire. Britain was a great power, and Britain's shaped influence. Governments around the world wouldn't do a lot of things they just wouldn't do unless they sent some emissary to the British government to effectively get permission, in the same way that they later would go to the United States, for example, to get the nod. Yeah, okay, you can do that if you want. But Britain was a policy maker and shaper on a global level at the time. You know, we're talking 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, that sort of thing. Now, Churchill was born in that era, and there's two things. Churchill believed that the empire was great and Britain had a great role to play in world affairs as the centre of the empire. But also Churchill came from the Marlborough, dynasty, if you like, of aristocrats. And Lord Marlborough had a huge name for being a general and a sort of a statesman general that played a major role in British history in the 1700s. So Churchill felt he had a destiny as, if you like, a warrior leader, and that Britain was a great empire, and so on. So the British government was, again, a policymaker shaper. Now, Churchill carried that view on, so that the view of the British establishment was, and had been for some time, certainly since the 7 Years' War, if not earlier than that, so since the 1700s, is that Britain should always maintain and ensure the maintenance of what was called the balance of power in Europe, that they should not allow any one country to become supreme and dominant, as this would ultimately relegate Britain to being a second-rate power. So if they, whether it was France, Napoleon and all this sort of stuff, or Hitler, or even earlier than that, you could still see those early days of, say, the Spanish Empire, or the greater Spanish Habsburg type empire, and so on, that the British even then were talking about this balance of power. So no one power on Europe was supposed to be, or allowed to be, in British policy terms at least. And they stayed with that even when Britain was no longer a world power. Now, between sort of 1880 or say 1875 and 1900, Britain had already slipped to being a second-rate power. This wasn't obvious on the at the very front of things, but they had already slipped in an economic and productive and engineering and technological sense. Both Germany and the United States had pulled decently ahead of Britain. Britain was, and the gap was widening. Now, Britain was huge in invisibles trade. This is insurance, shipping, capital raising, banking, finance, international conveyancing, all this sort of stuff. Britain was the biggest centre of that. So their trade in invisibles, as it's called, that is not physical goods, gave the appearance of Britain being still a wealthy, not that they were poor, by the way, they just on a relative basis, they'd fallen behind Germany and the United States. Germany was and the United States were very much at the apex of the newer technologies of the day, such as electronics and chemicals and dyes, fertilizers, optics, precision engineered steel, all that sort of stuff. The Americans and the Germans were well ahead on that. And Britain was falling behind at quite a rate, but not that it went unnoticed. You can dig up from the major newspapers at the time, and they were these there were editorials in there about, look, Britain's falling behind. We need to do something here. But the British had an ideological view of free trade, whereas Americans and Germans would use tariffs to protect their goods from British competition. And this allowed the British, the Germans, the Americans to develop value-add industries that the British didn't develop, or certainly didn't develop to the same extent. And you could see this in the munitions manufacturing and the standards of manufacturing in World War I. The Germans had their precision engineered field guns and heavy cannons, that sort of stuff. And the British didn't have and certainly not for the first 2 or 3 years of the war, didn't have anywhere near that same standard of craftsmanship and again precision engineering and so on. So this is Britain's already declining at a fast rate. Churchill was no economist, so he wouldn't have spotted that. Britain still had pretty advanced engineering in, say, naval engineering, the switching from steam to oil and these sorts of things. But already the German naval the units that the German Navy was producing were superior to the British ships and battleships and cruisers and frigates and so on. So Britain was already falling behind. They had many more battleships than anyone else. So numerically, they could sort of overpower others. But in terms of ship-for-ship technology, they'd already fallen behind in the early, say between 1905 and 1910. They'd already fallen behind, and demonstrably so. So Britain was no longer a great power. It was no longer an industrial powerhouse. It no longer had the technological lead in any field, really, at that time. So Britain was now. World War I was one where Germany had a much bigger economy than really anyone anticipated. Also, a much more efficient economy, a much better organised, better educated workforce. All this sort of thing. And so they were able to, even though heavily outnumbered and outgunned and economically, technically at least, quite a bit smaller, they were able to far more efficiently use the resources they had, and their quality of their field guns and all sorts of things. So they were able to drag the war out for 4 years, even though they came very, very close to winning, by the way. Now the First World War exhausted Britain, so it accelerated its decline. So Britain was already a second-rate power. Now, clearly a second-rate power. Churchill's still around. Now, when the Depression came, the British government was desperately trying to balance the budget and do all those sorts of things. And Churchill was warning about Nazi Germany, especially from sort of 1935 onwards, 1936 onwards. Now, the British government, again, their priority was balancing the budget. It wasn't rearming. And now the British government or their military advisors looked at the technology they had around at the time, the old tanks, the old guns, the old field guns, and they looked at it all and thought, well, wow, it's going to cost an absolute fortune to re-equip the army with modern equipment. So any chances of a balance, this is during the Great Depression, of course, where got unemployment at 25, 30%. The idea of balancing the government's budget with if we rearm is impossible. And they didn't want to let that go. So Churchill was saying, hey, we got to rearm, look at these guys. And he later on, he was sort of touted as a voice in the wilderness and only if we'd listened to Churchill and this sort of thing. That's bullshit. Churchill was saying, let's spend lots and lots of money on rearming, with modern equipment, because the World War I equipment was hopelessly outdated now. Let's have a look at the modern equipment. And they had examples, by the way. The French had built the Char B tanks and all that sort of thing. So already what did the modern tank technology look like? And they already had a very good idea of what that was. So estimates were done and cost estimates and so on. And whoa, that's going to cost a lot of money. So the British government freaked out that no, if we go down this path, we've got no hope of balancing the budget, and that's our objective. So they had a political economic objective there, and had they rearmed, they'd have had to let go of those political economic objectives of balancing the budget. So they didn't go down that path. Now, it was different with aircraft, where they could spend money on, they weren't having to replace in the same way the sort of masses of equipment they had. The planes were falling to pieces that they had. There weren't that many of them. So they could look at developing new technologies around the Air Force, and it wasn't seen as a replacement thing. So they did spend some money there, and in development of the Hurricanes and the Spitfires, all that sort of stuff. And so there was money and one effort and design and so on put into that, and that was, as it turned out, money quite well spent. Even there, they were probably a little tardy on it. They could have maybe put a bit more effort into that, but nonetheless, so they were prepared to spend money, but not on replacing masses of outdated equipment, which they ended up having to do anyway. But at the time, the mid 1930s, they didn't want to do that. Now, Germany had all their equipment taken away effectively by the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War One. So if they were going to equip the army, they had no choice but to build whatever the latest technology was, which they were doing. Even when World War II broke out, some of the Panzer ones and twos were hopelessly outdated already. Even by that, they were nothing better than armored cars, really. The Panzer III and IV were just about at the end of their, as in advanced technology, at the end of their technological lifetime. Bearing in mind that in warfare, the pursuit or the chasing of the newest, latest, killer technologies can make something that was can outdate lots of equipment very, very quickly at the speed at which technical development moves in time of warfare. Anyway, coming now to Churchill's. Now, Churchill, his manifest destiny as a great warrior leader, which he really believed he had, and the belief that Britain was a great empire. Churchill, you look at his writings and you look at he still hadn't got it that Britain was no longer a world power. On the face of it, maybe. It was still influential because America had gone into isolation. The Soviet Union was killing tens of millions of its citizens in a maniacal attempt to industrialize as quickly as they could. So Britain and France were, in terms of active world stage play, still world powers on at least a superficial level. But in reality, they weren't. The British economy was very fragile technically, and again, in pretty much any way you wanted to look. Industrially, R&D, innovation, Britain had fallen behind in most categories. There might be one or two where they were still sort of holding their own, but Britain was already clearly a second-rate power by the Second World War. In no way Britain had the resources to fight the war, which Churchill knew, and he knew without American help there is no way Britain would win or even survive, let alone win. Now, when World War II broke out, really the British government was still obsessed with this idea of a balance of power in Europe. And they thought if Germany controlled Poland, even though the Polish corridor was obviously going to be an issue that everybody knew had to be addressed at some point. So this idea that, the British were caught unawares or people didn't know, what a shock, that's nonsense. The Polish corridor that divided East Germany from Germany was always going to need to be addressed, and the British should have and the French should have eagerly addressed that to try and take it off the board as a possible future, chess piece in international relations or saber rattling or anything like that. Nonetheless, so Britain and France went to war to protect the sovereignty of, allegedly, the sovereignty of Poland. Now, when Britain and France were defeated in 6 to 7 weeks in 1940, that was a shock to everybody. There wasn't any military observer anywhere in the world, there wasn't one that wasn't raising their eyebrows over that. Whoa! So the efficiency of the German war machine was it was on display for everyone to see. Now, it was at this time that Churchill was elevated to the position of Prime Minister. So now there were quite a few people in the British government who thought, why don't we cut a deal with Hitler? The terms here he's offering are pretty decent. Now, Hitler, remember, is a sort of a lower middle class guy, and to be respected and treated as a great leader by the British establishment, the British government, was to him probably to Hitler, one of the greatest honours that could ever be bestowed upon him. And he wanted that. And it's quite clear looking back, he wanted that. And the terms he was offering Britain are, look, you can have your empire, don't care, that's all yours. But we'll take care of Europe, and we'll have mastery in Europe and so on. Now, if you look at the British discussions during the time, I thought, well, if Germany's in control of Europe, they'll have trading arrangements that suit them. Their finished goods, their machine tools, their all their industrial output will be locked out of Europe in effect, and so which happened anyway once the common market came after World War II. So the idea that Britain escaped the bullet is that's it happened anyway. So their worst fears about not being able to sell British goods in the continent. Now, bear in mind again, Britain was slipping rapidly behind the rest of the world in all sorts of technologies and quality of production and manufacturing, already slipping well behind. So Britain was already going to lose that. So the idea you go to war to protect something you're already losing and will lose anyway was quite absurd. Now, the British were concerned that Hitler may go back on his word. Now, that is a real concern. So that can't be written off. That Hitler was noted for strategically changing his mind, and so that does need to be considered. But my view is, looking back, is he probably would have stuck to that. The aggravation and needed to break that agreement would be such that I can't see Hitler would have done it. And he'd have been quite happy contained Europe. Probably would have invaded the Soviet Union anyway, which would have taken up his time. So I see Britain would have been pretty safe to have cut a deal with Hitler and would never have had to go to the expense and the drama that World War II, which relegated Britain to really a third-rate power by the end of that war due to financial exhaustion and so on. And Britain gained nothing from it. Britain gained nothing from the Second World War. So here's the argument here here are the varying arguments that, okay, Churchill rescued Britain from, German occupation. I don't think the Germans would have occupied Britain. Rescued Britain from speaking German. I don't think they would have insisted that the British speak German. So I think that's nonsense. So the idea that Piers Morgan suggests, we'd all have been goose-stepping around. Well, that's, again, utterly ridiculous. The goose-stepping was only soldiers on parade and nothing else. Nobody was goose-stepping anywhere. It was just soldiers on parade. So the idea, and the Soviet communists did that. The armed forces of Greece do that. Everybody is involved in doing it. So I don't know what on earth it's they're talking about. It's complete and absolute nonsense. Goose stepping. So my view is that Churchill saved what? If you look at the liberties that the German government, the Nazi government, took away from the German people, it's hard to point out to the liberties the Germans actually lost that were any different from liberties they had or didn't have before. Now, if you were Jewish or a communist or gay, lesbian, communist, Marxist, or if you were a gypsy, homosexual activist or something like that, things didn't go too well for you. But that was less than 1% of the population, and their legal rights were, I believe, trampled on. The Jewish people in particular, their legal rights were trampled on. They shouldn't have done that. I've always got a dim view of any government that, in order to get at people they don't like, takes away their legal rights, whether you're looking at January 6th or whatever it might be, what's going on in Britain at the moment. Or you've made a post that upsets transgender people, we'll put you in prison. What? Where's the legal rights of those? But anyway, so I don't think that really the Germans had lost all the liberty, that there was a loss of liberty around the loss of liberty, if you can even call it that, was targeted at a very small portion of the population. Not that makes it right. It doesn't. Their legal rights should still have been maintained, but it's a small proportion of the population. There's no universal taking of legal rights or of tyranny being applied to the masses. That didn't happen. And if you look at the way British prisoners of war were treated in Germany, they were, compared to others, at least treated very well. Even when food was hard to come by, the British prisoners were the last to be starved when food was in short supply. So What I don't think Hitler would have imposed any tyranny on Britain at all. So I don't think that's even a consideration at the table. So what did Churchill effectively do? Well, Churchill went to war to assert the old British tradition of the balance of power of Europe, and that somehow Germany could be stopped from dominating Europe. But all that happened was Europe became dominated by the Soviet communists. That's all that happened. And as we see sort of later on, after they went, the biggest economy in Europe by far, the most efficient, productive economy, well, not recently maybe, but the most efficient, productive economy was Germany anyway. So that the whole balance of power and British goods being sold into the continent, into Europe, that was stopped by the common market. And the list goes on and on. So what were Churchill's achievements, or the British achievements by fighting World War II? Well, zero. They achieved nothing. Now, if you look in the wider sweep of history, where the globalists are desperately trying to tear down the nationalist in Churchill, and others are trying to tear down, what he did. All he did was enable the new liberal world order that took away everyone's rights and freedoms anyway. So what was achieved by this? Now, you could argue that Churchill went to war and really ultimately achieved nothing. You know, that's an argument there. That doesn't mean, and not that he didn't make mistakes. He was a flawed human being, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't a great British statesman. He was, and that should remain there. Was he a racist and so on? Well, I don't think so. Did he have a dim view of activists from third world countries that were, trying to play moral superiority games? Sure, he had a dim view of those. Again, that doesn't make him a racist. So just in summary, Britain was already a second-rate power by the time it went to war in World War One. By the time World War II ended, it was a third-rate power. And Churchill, being an guy of empire, and a guy of, again, perceiving he had a manifest warrior destiny, saw the world through the rose-coloured glasses of his views there. And Britain went to war in World War II, or refused deals and offers from Hitler to cut a deal, refused those for reasons that were baseless and ultimately harmful to Britain. And for that, we need a wider sweep of history. And it's easy today to sit around and look back and say, well, ultimately Churchill actually didn't achieve anything, but that wasn't obvious at the time. And but just Britain's policy and his role, or his perceived role in the world, was already hopelessly outdated at that time. And I think that was ultimately the major failing of Churchill and the British government in 1940. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.